morning, everyone, and welcome to what I hope is going to be a wonderful presentation on how you can help reduce youth access to tobacco in your communities using point of sale and tobacco retail licensing options. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Barry Hummel. I am the co-founder of the QuitDoc Research and Education Foundation. I've been working in tobacco prevention since about 2006. And we're delighted that so many people have decided to jump on this training. Great information. We're going to start off here in just a couple of minutes with Brittany Chapman, who is the Tobacco Free Florida point of sale coordinator of that policy. She's going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes about some statewide information. And then I'm going to jump on at about 10:25 and talk about how the tobacco retail license works in the framework of what's currently federal law and state law, what options you have and where you are able to do the most good. I'm going to go for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a great panel discussion starting at about 11:10. It's going to go for about an hour. We're going to introduce people who have had success throughout the state of Florida in the tobacco retail license arena and have them share some of their experiences, some of the barriers they face, some of the success stories. We're certainly able to, we have questions that were submitted in advance of that. We're certainly able to take some questions in the chat during that. If you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the chat and we will try to get those answered during the panel discussion. And so with that, I'd like to move on and get this, get the party started. Of course, now that I'm ready to do that, my PowerPoint won't advance. There we go. So we're going to start off with a point of sale overview by Brittany Chapman, who's from the Bureau of Tobacco Free Florida. Brittany serves as the statewide tobacco policy manager for the point of sale policy area for the Bureau. Prior to joining the Tobacco Free Florida at the statewide level, she worked on various Tobacco Free Florida grant initiatives locally and regionally. Her areas of focus included flavored tobacco policies, school-based policies, point of sale policies, local tobacco-free partnerships, and tobacco cessation initiatives. Currently, she manages the program activities that focus on counteracting tobacco product marketing at the retail point of sale, of which the main focus recently has been tobacco retail licensing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hummel. I'm so glad to be here. And good morning, everyone. I hope the weather is doing well where you are. We're a little bit overcast here, and hopefully that has no bearing on my technological abilities today. So as Dr. Hummel said, my name is Brittany Chapman. I'm the statewide tobacco policy manager for the point of sale policy area for the state and community intervention section of the Bureau of Tobacco Free Florida. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today about the way that the Bureau of Tobacco Free Florida is affecting change in the retail environment. And that's really being done through the monitoring of existing policies and, of course, the pursuit of new policies, because naturally that's what comes after. A little bit about the Tobacco Free Florida program for those of you that may not be aware. The program is administered by the Bureau of Tobacco Free Florida, and it is a bureau within the Florida Department of Health. It is structured around 5 areas outlined in the CDC's best practices for comprehensive tobacco control programs. And those areas include program administration, cessation interventions, health communication interventions, and state and community interventions, which is where our program is housed. And of course, this, surveillance and evaluation. Now, where we are at this point, we've had many counties around the state that have adopted some form of a product placement ordinance. And what these ordinances or policies look like, they require tobacco product sales to be vendor assisted, and they typically do prohibit the placement of tobacco products on the counter, which will essentially decrease exposure and access to these products, particularly to our youth. The local ordinances, these product placement ordinances, they have predated the FDA law, which does require product placement for traditional tobacco products nationwide. But with that being said, we know there are some other policies that can have positive influences on our youth. And some of those include flavored tobacco ordinances. And the point of those really is to reduce and or prohibit the exposure and access of flavored tobacco products to youth. And there are some cities and states, if you will, around the country that have adopted some sort of a local flavored tobacco ordinance. And while those ordinances can include enforcement measures, the best way to implement those sorts of policies is really to ensure that they include a structure, if you will, for monitoring and enforcing the provisions of those local laws. And that's where a local tobacco retail license really does shine. A local tobacco retail license, or you'll hear it referred to as a TRL, is potentially one of the most powerful tools out there to affect the tobacco retail environment. A TRL does give local governments the ability to regulate the place, the manner, the time, you name it. It does give local governments the ability to regulate how those tobacco products are sold. And it can also allow them to regulate what types of tobacco products may be sold locally, which we know can be huge as it relates to reducing that exposure and access to youth. So while a TRL is the best method of implementing and enforcing point of sale restrictions, it really is a complex policy that is not often easy to obtain. But I'm happy to report that one of the counties that is on this call, two of them rather, have been able to do that. Within the first 3 years of transitioning our point of sale policy area here in Florida to a focus on local tobacco retail licensing, we've experienced two major, I say major in all capital letters, policy achievements. We've experienced a local TRL in Alachua County. We do have Ryan McGuire here representing Alachua County who can speak to that. And then we also have Martin County, which we also have representation on here as well, that have achieved local tobacco retail licensing here in the state of Florida. And more recently, on November 17th, within the last year, the Martin County Board of County Commissioners voted unanimously to adopt a local tobacco retail license that resulted in the following changes to how tobacco and electronic nicotine delivery systems, vape products, e-hookahs, all of those things will be sold locally. So what that has done essentially has increased the minimum legal sales age of tobacco and nicotine products locally to 21. I do believe Dr. Hummel will touch more on the significance of that later on. It also prohibits tobacco sales within 1,000 feet of a district school. It prohibits self-service displays and non-vendor assisted tobacco products placement. And it also requires tobacco and nicotine only retailers alike to obtain that local tobacco retail license, which is huge because currently those vape shop only retailers, there's some interesting things going on with that as it relates to the state retail license. So today, your local community tobacco programs and the Quit Doc Foundation will be training you on best practices for counteracting tobacco product marketing at the retail point of sale, some of which influenced the adoption of the state's second local TRL in Martin County. And again, it goes without saying, I love to have an attitude of gratitude. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I look forward to the great things that I know will be taking place throughout this training. So thank you again, and I will pass the stage back to Dr. Hummel.
Thank you so much, Brittany. That was wonderful. And such as stages are today, I guess I will, quote unquote, take the stage. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead. We're running ahead, and that's okay. That'll give us maybe a little bit more time in the breakout rooms. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right into my presentation, which is going to focus on how the federal law, the state law, and your local laws would all sort of interact. But I went backwards, of course, because, technology. So let me just get back to the place I want to be. Remember our goal here. My goal, I'm a pediatrician, right? So my goal has always been to reduce youth access to tobacco products. And, we've worked really hard in the United States to reduce youth access to alcohol. That's one of the reasons the age for alcohol sales is 21. And so we're looking at best practices for how do we reduce youth access to tobacco products in our local community. And we know that most of these sales are occurring at local retail outlets. We can debate about internet sales, but we know that most of this, about 70% of tobacco sales to youth are occurring in local businesses in your communities. So I want to start and give you kind of the global framework of where we stand and how this all kind of fits together. So let's start with federal regulation of tobacco. Interestingly enough, prior to June of 2009, the federal government didn't really regulate tobacco very well. It regulated advertising through the Federal Trade Commission and marketing, but didn't really regulate the products. I used to, when I speak to kids, I tell them that their Kraft macaroni and cheese was better regulated in that era than tobacco products were. And it wasn't until the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which we just now colloquially call the Tobacco Control Act, was signed into law in June of 2009, that we finally had the FDA regulate this highly addictive drug like it would any other drug in the United States. The original law was very specific. It was very precise. It was a cigarette-heavy bill, primarily. It did a lot to regulate cigarettes with very specific timelines. It also regulated roll your own tobacco, a subset of the cigarette market, really. And then it regulated smokeless tobacco. And those were kind of your three most common traditional tobacco products in the United States. But you can see there are a lot of gaps there, right? I mean, that doesn't regulate cigars in the least bit, which would be the most obvious omission from the original law. The original law did something very clever, though. It gave the FDA the authority to identify and regulate additional tobacco products down the road without having to come back to Congress and have more laws passed. This law really granted the FDA the authority to evaluate products on the market and decide when something was appropriate to be regulated, which is going to become very important, as you're going to see later. The law was very clear in its inception. The FDA legislation was designed to give the FDA the authority to regulate the products and the packaging. And it preempts states and local communities from passing tougher standards on the tobacco products themselves and the packaging. And you can understand why that would be important. If a product like Marlboro had to make 50 different types of cigarettes because each state decided they wanted it to be have different chemicals in it, or different packaging state by state, that would be, that was considered to be too burdensome. So the FDA was going to determine what could be in the package and what had to be on the package. For example, warning labels would be very consistent nationally. But the law was also very clear in the other direction. It did not preempt states and local communities from restricting the time, place, and manner of sales and tobacco marketing, something that Brittany mentioned earlier. So the states could pass tougher restrictions on those, and take alcohol as the model. I've been to counties where they're completely dry and you can't buy alcohol. I've been to places, cities where there's no sales of alcohol on Sundays. So local community standards, they change the hours for bars, right? So in Fort Lauderdale now, the bars are open till 4 a.m. because of spring break. But they've decided to change that this year because of COVID, and nobody bats an eyelash. They have always regulated the time, the place, and the manner of alcohol sales, and this was extended. The right to be able to do this locally was extended to states and local communities by the Food and Drug Administration law that was passed in 2009. Again, because it was cigarette heavy, it had specific timetables in it. Just 3 months after the law took effect, the sale of flavored cigarettes, with the exception of menthol, were banned in the United States. So many of those flavored cigarettes that a lot of us remember back over a decade ago that were really preying on kids have been removed from the marketplace. A year after the law passed, they had the smokeless regulations took effect, and primarily they were larger warning labels on both the packaging and the advertisements of smokeless products. And for the first time, it restricted the distribution of free samples of all smokeless tobacco products, except for what they called a qualified adult-only facility. This was really important, believe it or not, in rural communities that had rodeos or auto shows or auto races, where a lot of vendors would come and give out free samples of smokeless products, many times to underage minors. So those laws were built, those rules were built into the original legislation. But because they had the right to do more down the road, they finally, after a long discussion of how they were going to approach it, decided in April of 2014 to deem other tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, for further regulation. The e-cigarettes were not the only thing on the list, as you're going to see, but they made that proposal finally in April of 2014. Part of that discussion was, around the fact that e-cigarettes were promoting themselves as a medical device, like it helps you quit. And so many people felt like, well, if that's the case, they should be forced to go down the medical device pathway, which at the FDA is a much more strict and time-consuming pathway. The e-cigarette industry fought back and said, no, we're just a tobacco product. And so the FDA said, okay, we'll regulate you therefore as a tobacco product. So in April of 2014, they announced that they were going to do that. After proposing some regulations and going through a public comment period, they finally finalized those rules in May of 2016. Yes, the wheels of progress move slowly at the federal level. The rules that they put in place were going to regulate e-cigarettes, which was a big, huge win for those of us in tobacco prevention, especially with youth. It also regulated dissolvable tobacco, which is a fairly small share of the marketplace, but was a product that had kind of evolved in the late 2008, 2009 timeframe to be kind of targeting kids. Pipe tobacco, not really much of an issue for kids, but pipe tobacco was finally regulated. Pipe tobacco actually has tobacco in the name, and it took this long to regulate it as a tobacco product. Of course, hookah was on that list, which we seem to have gotten a good control of here in Florida after a kind of a wave of popularity around 2012. Cigars finally deemed as a tobacco product, even though they're completely tobacco, right? They're just rolled tobacco leaf, so they should be regulated as a tobacco product. And finally, future products. They created a kind of a wishy-washy category that said, if we think it's a recreational form of nicotine, we're going to call it that and regulate it. And that's the distinction I'd like everybody to think about. When I think about the regulation of nicotine by the FDA, I think of it in two camps. I think about the medical use of nicotine, like gum and patches, which is dosed appropriately, which is tapered over time, which has a goal of being nicotine-free at the end of treatment. And I compare that to things where people are doing it simply as a recreational drug. And that's why electronic cigarettes really fall into tobacco products. They do not and have not ever been shown to help with tobacco cessation. And the more articles you read, the more you'll realize that many people either dual use, or we see about a third of kids on average from the studies that are available now who start on electronic cigarettes and ultimately move to a more traditional combustible tobacco product. So they put this category in there to say if something new comes along, like we all know about the Philip Morris entry into the IQOS, I think it's called, the burn tobacco, just rapidly to create a smoke in that category. That would fall into that category. The nicotine water that was sold at airports a few years back was a huge flop, but that would be something that they would look at. Those new rules took effect about 3 months after they announced them in August of 2016. And the main rules that have a relevance to us is they were allowed now to review new tobacco products that were not yet on the market. So anything that they deemed as a tobacco product, they were going to be able to take a look at it before they could even get approval to sell it. There was a pathway where if it was substantially equivalent to something that already existed on the market, the pathway would be easier, but everything has to be reviewed. It's going to help prevent misleading claims by tobacco product manufacturers. This is going to parallel the language of light and low tar cigarettes that is now no longer valid and is no longer on the packaging because those were false claims. And so you can't say something is safer unless you prove something is safer. And if the FDA looks at it and really believes it's safer, they may allow them to market that as a harm reduction product. It's going to allow them to evaluate the ingredients of the tobacco products and how they are made, which is super important. And they're also going to start to communicate the potential risks of tobacco products with expanded use of warning labels. That really started about 2 years after that in 2018, but that's the reason we see warning labels on even Juul products now that say things like warning, this product contains nicotine, which is addictive. The other thing the FDA started to do recently was to take aggressive action against companies that are marketing flavored vaping products that appear to be targeting underage kids and teens specifically. So they're not going after all flavors yet. They're going after things that you could make the case are clearly targeting kids. And so an example of something when they started looking at this would be these products. On the left here, you see something called cereal treats, with a color scheme and fonts that completely mimics Lucky Charms. The implication there that this is just as safe as Lucky Charms. Now, as a pediatrician, I can tell you Lucky Charms themselves aren't all that safe, but that's a story for a different day. But there were many of these available. Here's cereal treats that look like Fruit Loops. Here's one that looked like gummy lifesavers, and on and on and on. Some of them will look like juice boxes. And so in the summer of 2018, the FDA and the Federal Trade Commission, again, I want to point out that the Federal Trade Commission works a lot on marketing and advertising type issues. They both got together and issued warning letters to companies that misleadingly labeled or advertised nicotine e-liquids as kid-friendly food products. So again, if they look like a juice box or a candy or a cookie or a cereal, they were warned and were subsequently pulled off the market. Pretty aggressive move by the FDA without really passing a specific policy. They just issued those warning labels. They did another batch in November of 2018 for some other offenders that were pointed out after that first wave of letters. And that was good. That was the first time we've seen them really say, hey, we know what these things are designed to do. In January of 2020, they then made an announcement that they were going to take very good action to remove the most unauthorized flavored e-cigarette cartridges from the market. Now, the use of the word cartridge is a trick because what they were referring to are replaceable cartridges for devices. A Juul would be the best example. So the Juul has cartridges that have different flavors, and you can swap them out of the device itself. So this rule really specifically applied to those types of cartridges. It would apply to any flavors, mint, fruit, dessert, candy, but not menthol or tobacco flavored products. So there's a little bit of a loophole in that menthol and mint are essentially the same thing. But again, any step in the right direction is welcome when it comes to trying to reduce youth access. It also, like I said, would only apply to these cartridges. So it didn't apply to open tank systems or disposable products. So the things I showed you before, like cereal treats, are actually the products that you would sell for an open tank system. Those were not affected by this rule. Nor was another product that popped in. So here's a Juul, which most of you are probably familiar with, and you can see the cartridges on the left. The green one is the mint. The yellow one is, I forget, I think it's caramel or caramel macchiato or something along those lines. But those were the replaceable cartridges that were affected by the rule. Well, nature abhors a vacuum. So the minute you take that off the market, somebody comes along with this product, Puff Bar. And again, this doesn't have a cartridge. This whole unit is disposable. And so all the flavors you see here fall through that loophole. If you ban the cartridges only, then somebody can fill this niche and go, well, this isn't a cartridge, so I'm allowed to sell it. Now, I would argue that there's a cartridge in there. All these devices have some sort of tank that holds the liquid. And in my mind, that's a cartridge. But again, when you pick a word like cartridge, you open yourself up to loopholes. And that's sort of what happens in the world of legalese. The other thing that happened that was incredibly important and incredibly interesting the way it happened was in late 2019 when, during budget reconciliation, Congress included language to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and raise the federal minimum age for tobacco sales from 18 to 21. Now, it's curious because budget reconciliation is only supposed to deal with things that are related to the budget issue. And maybe you can make the case that that's going to reduce the tax revenue, obviously, if you raise it from 18 to 21. But somehow that language was deemed okay by the parliamentarian. And so when that was signed into law, it raised the age nationally to 21. So you have to be 21 to purchase cigarettes, cigars, e-cigarettes, everything listed and deemed as tobacco products by the FDA. You have to be 21 to buy it. And the retailers have to identify that you're 21 in order to sell it. And I just want to have you put a pin in that. You have to be 21 to buy it, but the retailers are obligated to prove that you're 21 in order to sell it. There are two parts to that transaction: the retailer who's selling it and the person who is purchasing it. The problem is it's a federal legislation, so that can only be enforced by federal agencies, national agencies. And so the group that's tasked with that now is the FDA. They are responsible for conducting compliance checks nationally and proving, that somebody is selling to an underage minor. Remember that. Federal law is enforced by federal agencies because it's a big part of the story of what we're trying to work on here in Florida. One of the things they did right after that was they created the This Is Our Watch program. Many of you are probably familiar with this. These are free materials created by the FDA that are educational pieces both for the owners, the retailers, the clerks, as well as things that you put at point of purchase to inform customers about the law. But again, it addresses both parts of the transaction. There's educational materials for retailers and clerks, and there's educational materials for the people trying to buy tobacco. There's posters, there's stickers for the register, there's regulation flyers that are more educational for the retailers. There's an age verification calendar that was very well done, and I'm going to show you in a second. Signage again for the registers on the side that faces the retailer and the clerk, so they are reminded that they have to do this. And then an instruction booklet on how to operate the counter, which is incredibly important. And this is what that looks like. You'll notice on the right-hand side, you see 21 or older to purchase tobacco products. That's really the sticker set that you would put facing the people trying to purchase. But This Is Our Watch, that part of it is designed to face the retailers and the clerks to remind them that their responsibility is to check those IDs and make sure that people are old enough to do that. There's even, one of the language that was included is the sale of loosies, which are when people break cigarette packs up and sell 1 to 2 cigarettes, 3 cigarettes wrapped up in a rubber band. It makes it cheaper and more accessible for children and teenagers if you only have to come up with 75 cents to buy 2 cigarettes versus, $7 or $6.50 for a pack of cigarettes. And so this was, you'll see customer facing to remind the consumers that they don't sell loosies, but there's also retailer facing materials to remind the clerks that they don't sell loosies. So again, educating both ends of the transaction. This was the digital calendar that was created that sits on there and updates daily and tells you the date you have to be in order to purchase tobacco products. And again, because it updates daily, it's always perfect. You don't have to tear a sheet like some of the old tearaway counters. It just happens on its own. The other thing I want to share you was that in March of 2019, the FDA announced some compliance check data. Now, the date's important because this predates 21 being the age of sale. So this is data that consistently looked at 18-year-olds under the age of 18. So the way they did this was they reported out with violation rates of a collection of stores. So if they went into a gas station, say a Mobil, with underage minors and tested 100 stores, this category, between 35 and 44 of those stores would have sold tobacco to an underage minor. Think about that. 1/3 to almost 1/2 of stores in that business sold to underage minors. Those stores included Marathon gas stations, Exxon gas stations. Remember, some of these are with the attached convenience store. Sunoco gas stations, BP gas stations, Citgo gas stations, and Mobil gas stations. Not too many not on the list of gas stations that were found to have 1/3 of Exxon stations to almost 1/2 of Exxon stations sold to underage minors. This was from the press release. There was specific data on each of these businesses, and you can look that up on the FDA. The next category was between 25 and 34%. So that means that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the stores sold to underage minors. Look at who made this list. Shell, another gas station with a convenience store. Chevron, Casey's General Stores, which is a more regional version of those kinds of gas stations and stores, and 7-Eleven. Again, very similar. And not all 7-Elevens have gas. But in those categories, all of your big offenders are gas stations with or without a convenience store attached. But here's the scary one. Stores that had between a 15 and 24% failure rate. It included things like Family Dollar. 15 to 24% of all Family Dollars sold tobacco to underage minors under the age of 18 at the time of the survey. Kroger, that's a grocery store. Walgreens, that's a pharmacy. They had a failure rate of 22%. Almost 1 in 4 Walgreens stores were caught selling tobacco to underage minors. Circle K and even big box stores like Walmart. Now think about that. 22% of a pharmacy who's in the game of public health sold tobacco to underage minors. So when you get into these conversations about tobacco retail license and you hear this thing of like, well, why do we have to go into Publix and why do we have to go into Walgreens? Because they do violate it. They also make money selling tobacco, and they will make extra money if they sell it to underage minors. Not as much as a convenience store. The data generally shows that about 1/3 of income of any convenience store comes from tobacco sales alone. Think about that, about 1/3 of their income. So they're in the game of creating and maintaining addiction because it's about 1/3 of their profits. Let's move on to Florida, because Florida is an interesting, we have an interesting quandary here. So in the state of Florida, we have two main laws in the Florida statute that govern the regulation of tobacco. This has nothing to do with the Clean Indoor Air Act. These are just the two laws that govern the sale of nicotine, recreational nicotine in the state of Florida. The first one is Chapter 569, called Tobacco Products. This is the one that we've been looking at and studying for years and years and years. This provides the statewide rules for tobacco sales and use throughout the state of Florida. It authorized, it's the permit to sell tobacco is handled in this chapter. That's the tobacco retail license at the state level that you will hear us reference a lot. And that language says the following: permits shall be issued annually upon payment of the annual permit fee prescribed by the division. And then they go on to say the division shall fix the fee in an amount sufficient to meet the costs incurred by it in carrying out its permitting, enforcement, and administrative responsibilities under this chapter, but the fee may not exceed $50. And I can promise you that a $50 licensing fee is not covering the cost of the amount of enforcement needed in the state of Florida. That $50 fee is not going to be sufficient to meet the costs of permitting, enforcing, and the administrative responsibilities of conducting this program. But they put that fee in there. Cannot go higher at the state level. But the statute does not appear to preempt local governments from issuing their own tobacco retail licenses. And that has been weighed in on by the Office of the Attorney General. There was an unofficial Attorney General opinion during Pam Bondi's tenure as our Attorney General that basically said that local communities can pursue tobacco retail licenses. They are not preempted from doing so based on current Florida law. It restricts free samples. That's kind of consistent with the rules now at the federal level. And that language there was the gift of sample tobacco products to any person under the age of 18 by an entity licensed or permitted under the provisions of Chapter 210 or this chapter. It restricts the sale of tobacco products to people under 18 years of age. So you have to be 18 years of age or older to purchase tobacco products in the state. And that language specifically says it is unlawful to sell, deliver, barter, furnish, or give directly or indirectly to any person who is under 18 years of age any tobacco product. Very important. And then they give some violation information. The first violation is a second-degree misdemeanor. Subsequent violations are first-degree misdemeanors. I want you to note that that is for the selling, delivering, bartering, furnishing, etc. That is the retailer penalties, right? There's two parts of this transaction. So it also restricts the purchase and possession of tobacco by persons under 18 years of age. So this is the other half of the transaction. So it is unlawful for any person under 18 years of age to knowingly possess any tobacco product. It is unlawful for any person under 18 years of age to misrepresent his or her age or military service for the purpose of inducing a dealer or an agent or employee of the dealer to sell, give, barter, furnish, or deliver any tobacco product. So it's unlawful for you to have a fake ID and trick that clever retailer into selling you a tobacco product. You can already see where I'm going with this, right? For the first violation, to the purchaser, to the kid who's buying it, 16 hours of community service, or instead of the community service, a $25 fine. And in addition, the person must attend a school-approved anti-tobacco program if available. Second violation, within 12 weeks of the first violation, you just go right to the fine. And if you have a third or subsequent violation within 12 weeks of the first violation, the court must direct the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles to withhold issuance of or suspend or revoke the person's driver's license or driving privilege. Please pay attention to that. If you're the kid in this transaction who's a teenager, you run the risk of losing your license, but the retailer who's selling you this does not. There's no language for the loss of a retail tobacco license at the state level. $50 a year, which is insanely inexpensive for a license to do anything in the state. And, you know, the cost of doing business here is maybe a slap on the wrist and a fine. right? They make a third of their profits in tobacco sales. This is insignificant money, but they don't run the risk with repeat offenses of losing their license to sell at the state level. But the children run the risk of losing their driver's licenses. It's completely backwards, people. That's like going into a statutory rape case and saying the kid's more at fault and not the adult who preyed on the kid. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. And that's your tobacco lobbyists getting rules written in that seem subtle, but are incredibly important. The chapter also requires signage for the retailers, and that signage has very specific language. It says a dealer that sells tobacco products shall post a clear and conspicuous sign in each place of business where such products are sold, which substantially states the following. And this language is very specific. The sale of tobacco products to persons under the age of 18 is against Florida law. Proof of age is required for purchase. This is what most stores have, right? Something called We Card, under 18, no tobacco. A watered down version of what should be in the stores. The problem is these signs are provided by tobacco industry, given for free. And so that's what floods the stores. The industry's gone out there and put their signage up, which is watered down and not very impactful. And so we don't end up having the signage that's so very important that says the story about it's a law and you need a proof of age, etc. There's nothing on that sign that says proof of age, right? Or any of that kind of more important language. And so one of the things we really should be working on with if we're going to do this locally, would be stronger language in the stores, right? Let's get rid of the We Card program and really make them have the signs that they need to have. The other statute I'm going to touch on is miscellaneous crimes, chapter 877. And you may wonder why miscellaneous crimes would have anything to do with tobacco. And it's because in about 2014, the age for sale of e-cigarettes in the United States was not defined. There were no rules. And so the state of Florida also didn't have any rules, and several counties started to do age of 18 for electronic cigarettes as local ordinances. I think there was between 18 and 20 counties or cities that passed 18 as the age. And so finally the state took it up to do it as a state law. And in doing that, we were trying, because at the time the FDA had declared that e-cigarettes were going to be defined as a tobacco product. That was done in 2014, right around the time that this bill was in the legislature in Florida. It was the easiest step would have been to include the e-cigarette language in the tobacco definitions, and then everything's written there. But no, the e-cigarette industry managed to get up there and muddy the waters so that a separate statute was created under miscellaneous crimes to deal with nicotine products and nicotine dispensing devices. They created a separate category in federal law and buried it in a different law so that it wouldn't appear as a tobacco product. Florida restricted the sale of e-cigarettes at that time to those those under 18. Actually occurred before the FDA rules took effect. The FDA rules didn't take effect until, as you recall, the summer of 2016. However, Florida really went out of its way to avoid calling the products tobacco products at that time. They created this separate law to govern the rules on nicotine dispensing devices and nicotine products. They gave a very long, complicated definition of what a nicotine dispensing device was, but they also went out of their way to explain what it wasn't. So here, nicotine product means any product that contains nicotine, including liquid nicotine, that is intended for human consumption, whether inhaled, chewed, absorbed, dissolved, or ingested by any means, but does not include tobacco product as defined in the other chapter. So they said, basically, this is not tobacco. That was the sentence of everything else I showed you. That was really where they made the statement that they were not going to consider this tobacco in the state of Florida. They also carved out, nicotine products that were drug delivery devices or medications as governed by the Food and Drug Administration, which was totally appropriate. And then the wishy-washy line that says products that contain incidental nicotine. And that's another gift to the e-cigarette industry, because they like to talk about how there's nicotine in things like tomatoes and eggplant. That's their big one. And how maybe some of these nicotine devices that we have in the state of Florida, the nicotine's all been derived not from tobacco, but from eggplant, which is impossible. It's cost prohibitive. It would take $2,000 worth of eggplant to fill one nicotine cartridge. So it's not a real argument. But the industry even got the language in there about incidental nicotine, looking for other loopholes. Basically, what it did was it created a duplicate set of rules regarding the prohibition to the sale of minors, the gifting of samples, the possession of nicotine products by minors. Everything was identical. Even the signage, the specific requirements for the sign stated that the sale of nicotine products or nicotine dispensing devices to persons under the age of 18 is against Florida law. Proof of age is required for purchase. Again, I challenge you to go into any vape shop locally and see if they have that sign. You will not find it. And the reason you won't find it is because there was a carve out. The reason they did this more than any other reason was that if you don't call it a traditional tobacco product, it doesn't require a tobacco license at the state level. This entire exercise was put in there so that freestanding vape shops did not have to have a retail license. And today, as we sit here, they still do not. And so nobody's checking on signage because, one, nobody knows where these stores are at the state level. There's no list of licensees at the state level that the ABT could theoretically go out and evaluate for. Did they have appropriate signage? Are they selling to minors? The lack of a license means they can really hide in plain sight at the state level. So here's the problem that we face in Florida, right? The federal law is 21. It's enforced by federal agencies. We know they come down and do compliance checks, but if you're waiting for a compliance check in Okeechobee or in Stark, you're going to wait a long time because these guys are coming down to bigger locations with lots of stores so they can knock a bunch out simultaneously. The federal law makes it illegal for tobacco retailers to sell tobacco to anyone under the age of 21 nationally. That includes Florida. So technically the age in Florida for tobacco sales and purchase is 21. The problem is the statute in Florida still lists the age as 18. And so state agencies, which are governed by state law, do not have jurisdiction to enforce 21. The Florida Sheriff's Association has gone on record and said, until it says 21 in statute, we can't enforce that. Florida ABT is in the exact same position. And of course, Florida ABT doesn't even really go out to freestanding vape shops for 18 because of the licensing issue. So they can only enforce 18. It would certainly be nice if the Florida statutes lined up with the federal law, wouldn't it? Like if those two things were in line, wouldn't that be fabulous? Well, last year there was an attempt to do this, and I don't know how many people recall. I'm sure many of the people on the call followed this to some degree. But the bill that really ran all the way through was Senate Bill 810, sponsored by Senator Simmons, called Use of Tobacco Products and Nicotine Products. And it would have made Florida law consistent with federal law. It went through what the current federal rules were and lined them up perfectly. It would have increased the age to 21. It would classified liquid nicotine, e-cigarettes, vaping devices as tobacco products, just like in federal law. It would finally require a state tobacco retail license for freestanding vape shops, although when they wrote the law, it was still free of charge because, you know, $50 is going to put these guys out of business. But at least they would have had to be licensed, which means we would have had a list of where these guys were operating in the local communities. It banned the sale of flavored products currently banned by the FDA. So when the FDA said we're not going to allow the sale of flavored cartridges for products like Juul, that would have been the same in the state of Florida, which just makes enforcement easier. It passed the Florida House and Senate with bipartisan support, actually fairly high margin of victory in both the House and the Senate. It was supported by the Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody, but ultimately Governor DeSantis vetoed it last September. And in his statement about the veto, there was language in his statement that told you exactly where he got his talking points. And it was from the vaping retail associations. There was all this language about the black market. You know, that's the thing they always talk about, the black market. If you do this, if you ban these flavored cartridges, there's going to be a black market. Yeah, the black market's illegal. Like if you're caught doing that, you go to court and you go to jail. That's why we have rules. You're not supposed to do it. And if you're doing it in a black market, then you go to jail. I mean, we see that with pot, right? We see that with OxyContin pills that are being sold curbside. We don't want that stuff on the street. And so we have a system to take care of that. So that's a bit of a cop-out to use the black market thing. But ultimately, he was afraid that the ban on the flavors was really going to reduce this use of these products as a cessation aid. But let's be clear, they don't work as a cessation aid. And these flavors aren't about people quitting. It has nothing to do with anybody quitting anything. It's just about using, and then coupled with it's the point of entry for kids If you're an adult who thinks that quitting is so important to you that you're going to switch to this because it's so good for you, you could probably get away with doing it with just, mint or menthol, let's say. So that provides us the framework for why there's a need for local enforcement, because 21 is the age here in Florida, but it's not being enforced by any state agencies. So this is from 2017, and there was a movement in the United States to make 21 the legal age, and it worked out very well. 230 cities or counties. This was no states involved in the initial wave, but in 17 different states there was a movement, and many local communities started taking the banner of let's raise it to 21 to heart. So there was 230 in 2017. By 2018, there were 330 of them in 21 different states. And the blue states, there are 5, all had raised it to 21 at the state level, led by Hawaii, who was the first one to go. But it was Hawaii, California, Oregon, Maine, and New Jersey at the time who were the first 5. Massachusetts came on board as well. By 2019, 500 different cities and counties in 30 states had participated in this. And again, if you see the blue states, we're not quite at the halfway point, but it was slowly becoming the preponderance of states that were raising it to 21. And that prompted the federal action. And so that by the time we got to that late 2020, by the time we get to 2020, Tobacco 21 is the law of the land. But all the states that are outlined in red also have a state law to make it consistent. You will notice Florida is not outlined in red. All the states that have red font have local laws to raise the age of 21. 3 of the people involved in that are going to be part of our roundtable here shortly. So we have local ordinances to raise the age of 21 in the state of Florida. We just don't have the state law. Almost didn't quite get it across the finish line last fall. By the time the federal law passed, 33 states had already raised the age to 21 statewide. By the time the federal law took effect, over half the population was already covered. Now the entire population is covered by the federal law. And 555 plus states, cities, counties had raised the age at that point. So this is, we're at the tipping point with respect to trying to get 21 consistent in law for enforcement purposes, because that helps with local enforcement. So in the absence of state leadership here in Florida, it falls to local counties, cities, and municipalities to create specific and enforceable rules to reduce the access to tobacco products for those under the age of 21. Current federal law allows, or what we call enables, local governments to regulate the time, place, and manner of tobacco sales and marketing, and nothing in the current Florida law preempts local governments from creating these regulations. It is all fair game. And so the single best approach to this is to create a tobacco retail license, which Brittany mentioned earlier. So what is a tobacco retail license and how does it work? Tobacco retail license, or TRLs as the shorthand language goes, are policies that give local communities the ability to dictate the most appropriate way to sell all nicotine products in their neighborhoods. It can be used to raise the age of 21, as we've seen. It can be used to expand the definition of tobacco to match federal law. It can be used to reduce the location and density of tobacco retailers, just like we do with alcohol licensing. It can be used to limit point of sale advertising and tobacco product placement as a condition of the license. You can put rules in the license for what you want in your local community. It can even be used to restrict the sale of flavored tobacco. California has led the way on this in their tobacco retail license language. But most importantly, it improves enforcement of whatever rules you choose, because the enforcement is done by people in your community. You're not waiting for ABT. You're not worried if the sheriffs are going to participate. It doesn't have to be a state agency. It can be a local agency. What are the key elements of an effective tobacco retail license policy? The first and most important is that all tobacco retailers are required to obtain a license and renew that license annually. And when I say all tobacco retailers, I'm saying that includes the vape shop owners, everybody in the community, cigar shop owners, everybody in the community. Ideally, the licensing fee should cover the cost of enforcing the ordinance. We call that revenue neutral. What I mean by that is, me as a taxpayer who doesn't use tobacco shouldn't be on the hook for enforcing these rules. The people that are being enforced should. I'll give you an example. I get a medical license. I have to renew it every 2 years. It costs me a lot of money to do that. That's to make sure that we have doctors in the community that are safe to be practicing medicine. So the board reviews and takes action against physicians who are not doing things appropriately in their community. That's it. We self-police through a medical license fee. That's what this is. It's designed to self-police the peers, your peers as a tobacco retailer. So when a tobacco retailer says, well, why do I have to do this? I don't sell illegally. Yeah, but when almost 50% of tobacco retailers, in the convenience store world are doing that. If you're one of the 50% that's not, there's still 50% who are, and you're part of that. You're not reining these people in, and so we're going to have to do it for you. There should be significant consequences through both fines and penalties, and penalties should include suspension of license or ultimately the revocation of the license. That's where they lose the most money. A fine, a fixed amount, $250, $500, $1,000, whatever you make it, is a penalty. But if you take away their ability to sell tobacco for 3 months, when a third of their profits are from tobacco, that they pay attention to, or the loss of the license and not being able to have that revenue stream ever again, they will quickly conform to the rules and sell to the customers that are legal and not the customers that are illegal. So again, the fine should be stronger for the retailer breaking the law than for the underage minor attempting to make the purchase. And then there's a stipulation that any violation of local, state, or federal law signifies a violation of the local law as well. What do I mean by that? If you get a report that the FDA was in town and so-and-so's Chevron station was out of compliance, that should be a ding on the local license as well. If you get a report that they broke the law, they broke your law too. What are the components of a solid ordinance? Well, purpose and findings. That's a section, obviously, that explains the evidence for why this is helpful for your community. You should create your definition section to include anything you want to cover: flavored tobacco products, what's a nicotine dispensing device, what do we mean by a self-service display. Again, tobacco products is a good one because you can roll a lot of things into there. Vending machines, which are generally a no-no by federal law as well. It allows you to define the rules specifically, and there's plenty of models out there that have great language for this. The licensing fees. You have to have fees. The fees provide the revenue for administering and enforcing the ordinance, and also for retailer and community education. You're going to hear from Martin County some clever ways to use some of the money for student intervention, for example. So the fees are designed to help the community reduce this problem. You should have a periodic review and adjustment of the fees. Make sure that it is covering all of the costs that are incurred, including the cost of compliance checks. You should have compliance checks. All licensed premises must be open to inspection by law enforcement or other authorized city or county officials during regular business hours. It might be code enforcement. It may be a subcontractor who's doing that. These are all viable options. But the licensees are agreeing to random compliance checks. From time to time, you should have language that says specifically at least some number of times per year, the city or county will conduct compliance checks. And we suggest at least one compliance check in every retailer per year, because the pharmacies need to know you're coming too, and the grocery stores need to know you're coming too. We understand that in local communities, you know who the problem stores are, and they're going to want a little more attention. But when those stores are shut down for 3 months, those kids are scrambling to find tobacco in other places. So you really need to monitor all the stores. And we would suggest more than one compliance check per retailer per year. Twice is probably ideal. It's just enough of a oversight to make people realize that it's coming. Violations and penalties are incredibly important. At its core, a licensing ordinance is intended to regulate the behavior of the licensees. So penalizing underage persons really takes away the focus of the licensing code. And it pulls enforcement resources away from the licensees to the consumers, to the young kids, many of whom are addicted to nicotine, many of whom who didn't know better when they started. We shouldn't be penalizing the kids more than we're penalizing the retailers. And by the way, the state law covers the kids just fine. The rules are pretty strict in the state law. You should focus your energy on the licensees. There's no strong evidence to support an assertion that penalizing underage persons is a more effective way to reduce youth smoking. That's a canard that the tobacco industry likes us all to believe. Many of those underage persons laws were lobbied for by the commercial tobacco industry to punish youth users and then let the industry off the hook. And then you'll hear language like, well, people were better parents, right? So penalize the kids, make the parents feel guilty about this behavior. That's all language that was really put forth by the tobacco industry. fight the urge to do that or fall prey to that. You can tell people the state law covers the kids just fine. They can lose their driver's license at the state level. That's a pretty significant penalty. How about we focus on the group that's really the problem, the ones who are selling these to kids in an illegal fashion. Those penalties should include a substantial fine with increases for repeated violations. They should also include suspension of licenses with increased length of time for repeated violations, and ultimately the loss of the ability to make any revenue from the sale of tobacco if you continue to break the law. And no matter how large the fine is for violations, retailer will simply pay it as a cost of doing business. The real financial penalty comes from the loss of revenue from a suspended or a revoked license. It's a significant dollar amount that gets lost if you cannot sell tobacco for 2 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, or forever. And so please focus your energy on the license revocation. I can't say this enough. When you put a local license in play, it allows you to revoke it. You control that. If you revoke the license, it doesn't matter if they have a state license. You are saying you are not allowed to do business in our community because you're violating the law. And that is fair game. And so it's really important to put the license in place so you can take it away. And I think in Martin County, you're going to hear an interesting discussion about how they handled fees. But the key was they got the license so that they could take it away if they had to. So again, at a minimum, the licensing ordinance should mirror current FDA rules on tobacco. The age of sale, 21, no self-service sales, which is built into the FDA rules. No vending machine sales would be important to address. Ban on flavored products that are banned by the FDA, to me, would be super critical. Because that they're not allowed to be sold here anyway. You're just underscoring that in local law. You're not creating new law by putting that flavor language into there. No loosies, which has been a big part of cigarette sales since the inception of the Tobacco Control Act in 2009. No free samples of tobacco products or nicotine products, which is a big part of the rules at the federal level. Age verification with government issued ID, incredibly important. And then signage regarding age of sale, and making sure that that signage has language in it that you want it to have and is not the We Card program provided by the companies. And then lastly, I think this is probably the last slide. We're running a little bit ahead, which is great, but plug-in options are something that you can fine tune your language for things you want in the local community. This was really pioneered in California, and they change the plugins year to year. When you go to apply for your license, if there's a new rule that's popped up or a new issue that you want to address, you can add that language to the retail license on an annual basis when people come to reapply each year. So what would be examples of that? Well, you can add additional policies to keep their license structure by reducing density near schools. You could put proximity restrictions near schools, like within 1,000 feet of a school, or you could pick other youth venues. You don't have to limit it to schools. You can name specific parks or playgrounds where kids frequently play and put a proximity restriction on that. You can cap the licenses. This is frequently done with alcohol licenses. In certain communities, you have to buy a license from another licensee. There are no new licenses. And then no product discounts or minimum pricing. So that would be like you can't accept coupons. You can't sell buy one, get one free. Those are all marketing dollars that try to reduce the cost at the retail outlet to make it easier for kids to purchase them, right? If you can buy 2 packs for the price of one, kids can pool their money together and go get 2 packs of cigarettes. But if you set a no discount policy in your language, or no coupons, or even minimum pricing, I think Maryland's a state that has minimum pricing statewide. There's no way to use a coupon. A pack of cigarettes costs this in the state of Maryland. And so you can set minimum pricing for cigarettes, and that reduces the choices for kids among, you can get a second tier product cheaper than you could a first tier product. But if they're all $7 a pack, or they're all $8 a pack, then it doesn't matter. There is no brand that is cheaper, that is more accessible by kids. And also prohibitions on sales at pharmacies. You can actually say, we're not going to allow the sale of tobacco at pharmacies. And some of the examples throughout the country include that language, where your Walgreens and your CVS, of course, has voluntarily pulled it. So Walgreens is the big one standing, but you can actually prohibit the sale of tobacco products at pharmacies. And you can even ban additional flavored products at your discretion if you feel the need to do that. And there are certainly many communities, as Brittany mentioned earlier, who put flavored bans in place, as part of their rules and regulation locally. Those are additional things, optional plug-in policies, not necessarily core components of a great solid license, but everything you add really helps reduce youth access to tobacco. And so with that, I'm a little bit ahead, so I'm totally fine taking some questions, and Val's informed me that there's a question in the chat. So let me just go look at the chat real quick and see. Are there any counties besides Martin and Alachua who have started this process and possibly didn't get it passed or who were having some issues, and what were their barriers? I think the biggest barrier, there was plenty of places who started doing it and then stopped the process because of the state law last year. And what I mean by that was they all went, oh, the state's going to take care of this, so we don't need to do it. So for example, I live in Broward County and I volunteer with the Broward Tobacco-Free Partnership, and Wilton Manors, which is adjacent to Fort Lauderdale passed a 21, and Wilton Manors started looking at it because they're the next city. So they were worried that kids were going to come out of Fort Lauderdale and go to Wilton Manors to buy tobacco. So they started looking at it as an option. And then the state law started happening. And then all of a sudden they stopped. We lost the momentum. And then it doesn't get vetoed till September. And so places that were further along, Martin County, you'll hear that experience today, it was easier to pick it back up and get it across the finish line. Whereas, you know, in Broward County, there was a lot of cities that we had some initial discussions with, and now we got to go back and readdress that because of the veto. Then the election happens and there's new people in city council. And then, so it's those kinds of barriers. It's not that people aren't interested in doing it. The other thing is it's always braver to go first. You really have to applaud Alachua County for the work that they did, because they set the bar for people to say, yeah, it's doable and it passed muster and it's working, et cetera. So that a Martin County go, well, we don't want to go first. Well, you're not going first, you're going second or whatever. And so it becomes easier. And then Martin County does it in South Florida. And now Palm Beach looks at it and goes, well, that's adjacent. We should be able to do this. Broward looks at it and goes, oh yeah, this is a doable thing. So when we did flavored tobacco resolutions many years ago, there was a tipping point. People were going out trying to get counties to say, we would like to see retailers stop selling flavored tobacco products. It was all it was. It was a resolution. There was a tipping point with about a third to 40% of the counties or cities had gotten resolutions where everybody, like before you knew it, the map was full. So yeah, it's a little slower at the beginning, but as we get more examples of places doing it, it's going to get easier and easier and easier. So in Broward County, we're going to go to the city we think is the closest that's ready to do it, which would be Sunrise. And we're going to work on that first to get it perfect, because the minute Sunrise does it, there's 5 other cities that will do it, you know, quickly. And then once you have 5 on the books, there's 31 cities in Broward County, right? So all of a sudden it's like, well, this is not an unusual thing. That would be my approach to that. So if you're struggling locally, I'd still educate, I still work on it, I still show examples from around the state, but just keep going back to it, because when there's 6 counties who've done it or 8 counties who've done it, then counties are going to look at it a little more seriously. And then Val tells me there's a question before that. Where does menthol fit into this call to action? Okay, so menthol is a complicated one. Menthol is an FDA rule that we can't tinker with, because until it's specifically carved out in FDA rules of cigarettes. And so until the FDA works on it, remember that's contents of the package. They mess with contents of the package. Now, could you do a local menthol ban? I believe you could. You can't say you can't have menthol in the cigarettes, but I think you could potentially say all flavors, including menthol. And that would be fair game locally. It might be a hard sell because of the FDA rules. So that's not the sword I would die on. I'd like to see menthol gone as much as everybody on this call. But if they're going to go, well, the FDA allows it, why would we not? I wouldn't get into that. I wouldn't die on that sword, like I say. But ultimately, I think menthol will be removed. It's a huge disparity issue. It's a health equity issue for a lot of ways among minority populations who use those products more. And so I think there will be a time where that will change. And if you look at the initial discussion of why menthol was left in there, and I don't want to go off on too long of a tangent, but the Congressional Black Caucus was mad that menthol was carved out at the time. They were upset. And the reason they were upset is because African Americans use menthol cigarettes in a way higher prevalence than other populations in the United States. And they felt like that there were some racial undertones to leaving menthol alone. why would you leave that in there? That is a health disparity for African Americans because it keeps them using tobacco products in higher proportions than other populations in the country. That was a Congressional Black Caucus was making those kinds of noises in 2008. The fact that we're still talking about it now is fascinating to me, and I think ultimately it will disappear. So I would say use your discretion. If somebody asks you about it, you say you could certainly do that. There's nothing to hold you back from that. And then in a further discussion, if you get some blowback about it, I wouldn't force the issue. But I certainly would, at a minimum, shoot for, if the FDA has banned it, you're not banning it here. You're just enforcing that rule by putting it in your ordinance. And that's an easier sell than making somebody in a city of Vero Beach think that they're banning flavored tobaccos on some sort of aggressive posture. That's not really the case. You're just, by saying the FDA has said this, we should say it too. I think that's an easier sell. There's one other comment here, and I'll turn it over because we're getting close to the 11:10 mark. But when I once explained to a vendor that he was selling flavored cartridges that were in violation of the law, I actually said, so what are you going to do? Call the FDA. And he was right. And you can make a referral. There is a hotline at the FDA. I would do that. I'd say, yeah, I am going to call the FDA. In fact, keep your number in your phone and do it while you're standing there. Just call the FDA right there. Go right on there, or go to the webpage and file the paperwork. What's your address, sir? Because I got to put it in this FDA thing. I would do it just because of that kind of statement. What are you going to do? Call the FDA? Yes. But what you really need to do is have law enforcement locally that can come in, and that's the whole point, to reinforce everything we've talked about. The idea here is to say, no, I'm going to call the Stewart Police. What are you talking about? You're not supposed to do that here. And that's the beauty of a local tobacco retail ordinance. All right. With that, I'm going to stop a couple minutes early because I think I got all the questions out of the chat. So
one more.
Yeah, Val, go ahead.
One more about paraphernalia. It's right above what you just read.
Okay. Can licensees include paraphernalia restrictions since drug paraphernalia falls under tobacco use by law? Specifically, what you're working on with tobacco retail licensing, I would think would be tobacco paraphernalia. So some of the things that you've seen included in there would be things to carry products on the back of a cell phone, or kind of ancillary materials. A lot of the things are included in the definition of tobacco products at the FDA. So anything that's part of the device itself is already rolled into the definition of tobacco when you read those definitions. But the ancillary stuff, when you get into things like cigarette lighters, or certainly with vaping devices, because there's dual use of vaping devices with marijuana, THC versus tobacco and liquid nicotine, those devices can get lumped in as electronic vaping devices under that definition of tobacco, which helps you reduce a lot of that kind of drug paraphernalia. And by the way, if you have those kinds of devices for sale in your local head shops, they should qualify for that license as well. They become tobacco retailers by default if they have any components of a vaping device on sale. And so you can actually then, if you have them licensed, then you can monitor them just as carefully because of the fact that they sell quote unquote tobacco products in their shop. You can certainly require them to have a tobacco retail license if they have vaping devices on premises. Not that they're selling them for nicotine, but that is included in the definition of tobacco products. And so there's a way you can loophole yourself into monitoring those stores more carefully in your local community. That may not be a position of the Department of Health, but that's I would throw that out there as something that is a side benefit to the way that is defined in both FDA law and hopefully your law as well. So was that all the questions, Val? Okay, so I'm going to for some reason my screen stopped sharing, right? So I need to share my screen again. So we're going to move on now to what I hope and feel is going to be the better part of the discussion, and that is the panel discussion with some of the experts from around the state who have actually pulled this off in the early phases. So you're looking at the people who have pushed this locally and got a victory. And I'm going to introduce each of the members first and let them share a little bit about their story. So the first person I'm going to introduce you to is Ryan McGuire. So Ryan is from Alachua County. He's worked on tobacco prevention issues in Alachua since October of 2018. He's received both his Bachelor's of Arts and History and a Master of Public Health from the University of Florida. He currently leads the Tobacco-Free Florida grantee efforts in Alachua County, while also assisting with data analysis and communications for the COVID-19 response. I challenge anybody on this call to say that they're not dual purposing with COVID at this point. Outside of work, Ryan enjoys hiking, weightlifting, cooking, and traveling when there isn't a global pandemic. My favorite line of any bio that was sent in. I enjoy traveling when there's not a global pandemic. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to share a little bit about his experience in Alachua County.
Thanks, Dr. Hummel. I won't speak terribly long, but thank you again to you and Valerie and QuitDoc for inviting me to participate. Obviously, I think this is a very good opportunity for other counties to get together, talk about their successes, their failures, and how we can continue to advance these TRLs locally. So Alachua is obviously propped up a little bit because we did achieve this first. I sometimes say it's a little bit of it was left a little bit lightning in a bottle. Very strong partnership members who are really just passionate about this. We had strong community leaders who wanted this. But we will say that since that retail license has gone into effect, it has been received relatively well, not just locally, but statewide, gotten Alachua some great attention. It wasn't the easiest thing to accomplish. We've had some unexpected challenges and things that did come up. But in my 2+ years of working at our health department, it's been a very fulfilling, rewarding practice. Obviously worked with Brittany every step of the way for a lot of assistance and figuring out some new challenges. And there's a lot of things that went into it that we didn't anticipate in 2018 when it passed, and then in 2019 when it went into effect. Lots of new things with communication, outreach, education, a lot of challenges, but it's definitely been a good experience. So looking forward to sharing more of that. Thank you.
Awesome, Ryan. Yeah, we're really excited to hear from you. I have questions I've written down for you, believe it or not, about some of the enforcement information. So great to have you on the call. Next up, we have one of the stars of QuitDoc. This is Kim Wasser-Nash, who is our tobacco prevention specialist and community health advocate in Martin County. She's been with us since 2012. That makes me feel old. Working in community outreach and policy change and coalition building. She is a 2012 Florida State University Alumni Association 30 under 30 recipient. So I don't want to do any math there, but 30 under 30 in 2012. Anyway, she's also the 2015 AFP Treasure Coast Volunteer of the Year, the 2013 and 2014 Rising Leader Award recipient for the Florida Public Relations Association of the Treasure Coast, and she's a graduate of Martin County's leadership class number 23. It is a delight for me to welcome Kim.
Hi, thank you guys so much. My picture is also probably about from 2012, so no longer under 30, and the picture maybe not as updated as it should be, but I'm here from Martin County. As you've probably already heard, is that we had the great accomplishment of being the second TRL policy to pass in the state, and that was at the Martin County Commission back in, I guess, November. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but we definitely faced a lot of challenges. The first reading, there was a lot of unexpected resistance to doing this policy, but we pushed through it largely in fact, and thanks to the fact that we had a champion who was on the county commission, and Commissioner Stacey Hetherington, who's now the commission chair. She has 2 kids in middle school, so this was a big issue for her, especially considering middle schools here are where a lot of the vaping selling and use is starting, unfortunately, on campuses pre-pandemic when kids were still going to school. And we also then moved into a smaller policy with the city of Stuart, which had a different set of challenges from the county. So look forward to talking a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Kim. I was delighted to be part of that process in Martin County and attend a couple of those meetings. And it's always touch and go in those meetings, but it's always a lot of fun to actually see something cross the finish line. So kudos to you for a very good effort in Martin County. Next up, we have Kylie Savoy from Indian River County. She is been with us just since 2018. She's our community health advocate and tobacco prevention specialist there in Indian River. She graduated from UCF in 2018 with her BA in sociology, but with a focus on the social determinants of tobacco use to guide tobacco prevention efforts. She's currently working towards her master's in public health with a focus on epidemiology, exploring how tobacco use is associated with food insecurity. She's been a member of our team for almost 2 years and continues to work toward her goal of achieving health equity and tobacco control. I'll tell you that Kylie came to us when she had an intern project. She ran past us, can I work with you guys on an intern project? And Leslie Spurlock, who was in Indian River at the time, supervised that project. And then Leslie, at the young age of 66, decided she wanted to retire. And whenever I get those phone calls, it's always dicey. It's like, here's this fabulous person who's worked for us for a long time telling me she's going to retire. But everybody who's ever left us has always said, but I have found the perfect replacement. And so Kylie was recommended. And Kylie, if she stays with us till she's 66, well, first of all, I won't be here. But anyway, if she stays with the organization till she's 66, that means we've done a good job shepherding this organization into the future. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Kylie.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Hummel, for that introduction. So I have been with the Quit Talk Foundation for 2 years, and I've been working on tobacco retail licensing since 2019 in August. Right when Leslie decided she was going to retire, we had one last meeting with the county commissioners to just introduce them to something we were going to be working on in the future. And our champion at the time was like, oh no, let's do it now. They had ended up voting it down and waiting on state action, but since then we have worked with the city of Vero Beach to raise the age to 21. And as of yesterday, the county is looking at raising the age to 21 and licensing retailers. They did approve that yesterday, so it'll be interesting to see the language that comes out of that. But I am excited to kind of share my experience with everyone, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kylie. Again, once you get the ball rolling, let's say in Indian River County or Vero Beach, if the city does it, then the county feels compelled to do it, and so that's the second county where we've had that happen, and so that's been fantastic. And then, of course, last on our panel, I won't spend a lot of time reintroducing her, is Brittany Chapman, who's the representative from Tobacco Free Florida, who works on this policy at the state level. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to move into sort of a panel discussion. I encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to put this into speaker view so that whoever's speaking at the time will be the main face you will see on the screen. I'm actually going to start with Kylie. I have a question here that I think your story fits the most, and that is, what have you found to be the biggest barriers in obtaining buy-in from decision makers on policy change, whether that's Tobacco 21 or the TRL, and how have you kind of fought back on those barriers?
So I think one of the most common barriers that I have encountered with my work with the city and the county is they don't want to overregulate business. That is a phrase that I hear time and time again, is, oh, we don't want to overregulate. And it really comes down to reminding them that, one, nicotine is a drug. It is a drug that is as addictive as heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. And, Dr. Hummel spoke to how we regulate alcohol in this state in particular. There are a lot of different counties that have a lot of stricter regulation. And so it's important that, we do remember that nicotine is a drug. And then also just reminding them we're not over-regulating at this point. The federal law is 21. The federal law does ban the sale of flavored cartridges. So really you are just aligning our county with the federal law that is already in effect. And usually once you remind them of that, they understand, oh, okay, so this isn't an over-regulation. This is just so we can enforce what is already in place.
Kim, I feel like you have a little bit of a similar, maybe not as hard as Kylie's story's been, with something like you were talking about at the first meeting where you had some resistance that popped up late. Is there anything, do you have any insight on that? How do you cross those barriers when they pop up?
Yeah, long history, Dr. Hummel and I, he's been really active here in Martin County. So we have a lot of long-standing relationships with many of the commissioners in Martin County who have been commissioners for many years. So going into the first meeting, we obviously knew where some of them stood, especially the one who was championing this whole policy. But some that we expected, who have really been progressive and advocating for tobacco control measures in the past, kind of threw us for some surprise. And the main reason that they stated was because they were concerned about, like Kylie said, overregulation, but primarily putting a burden upon businesses who already have a state license and requiring them to get a local license. And originally, Martin County was planning on a $300 license fee to, right? It was $300, is that right there?
Yeah.
$300 license fee. And that was going to not only cover the cost of all of the enforcement and the checks on the stores. But it was also intended to form a fund with the county that they could then use to fund tobacco prevention measures through the schools and things like that, and education programs, which would have been amazing. But because there was some concern about the requiring a second license, almost immediately that $300 fee was removed from the conversation. It also wasn't tied to the ordinance. They were going to vote on what the fee would be after they passed the ordinance, so it was really not relevant to the conversation. But regardless, they ended up negotiating a compromise through their legal department, which basically, if you already had a state license, you weren't going to be required to pay for a second fee for your local license. Only if you didn't have a state license would you be required to pay a fee. And with that, it kind of took the argument off the table that you were over-regulating or putting a burden on these businesses. One of the other things that we got a few times that came up was your mom and pop like bookstores that also happen to sell cigars in the back. I'm just going to let you all know that I've lived here my whole life and we do not have any mom and pop bookstores that sell cigars in the back. So I don't know who those stores were, but I think the biggest point that we overcame that was when Commissioner Hetherington, who was spearheading all of this, in between the first reading and the second reading, she went out and met face to face with the cigar shops that were here in town. I think that was where most of the resistance was coming from, is what we found out. And the fact that she sat down with the owners of those cigar shops, asked them what their concerns were, and then addressed their concerns was the major reason that we ended up with a policy win in this. So I think not being available and not being afraid to approach your natural opposition on these issues is one of the most important takeaways, because they actually spoke in support of the ordinance at the commission meeting, which was not expected. To have a cigar advocate group representative stand up and say that he really didn't have a problem with the ordinance was the reason that it unanimously passed.
Yeah, and just because I was part of that one, I'll add that the big issue for the cigar owners was the issue of self-service. And because many of these higher end cigar shops have a humidor where people walk in and pick and choose, and they have boxes of products laying around the store, the compromise that was reached was the IDs checked at the door. So if you're in the store, the self-service becomes less of an issue. And that's how they couch that terminology to allow the cigar store owners to still have, so adult only stores. It wasn't specific to the necessarily to cigar shops, but it addressed the key issue for the cigar owners was that they do business differently than a convenience store. And they're not really, and we know they're the kinds of cigars most of those businesses sell aren't the kind that are targeting kids. Kids aren't going to go and get a $30 cigar that's, you know, cognac, dipped in cognac. That's not what they're buying. So yeah, Commissioner Hetherington did an amazing job by actually going out and speaking to those. And it was probably, I think it was 3 or 4 cigar shops who were involved in that conversation. And to have them speak, yeah, I'm with you, Ken, to have them speak in behalf of it on that final reading went a long way to why it was a unanimous vote. Of that, I have no doubt. So I didn't know if Ryan or Brittany wanted to jump in on the question of barriers early in the game. Does anybody else, any insight they want to add? All right, well, the next question I have here is more about coalition building. What's the best way to gain community partnerships, members, school districts, leaders, et cetera, who give support and assistance when working on a policy change like this? And I think I'm going to start with Ryan on this one, because I think Alachua County had good success with this. Ryan, did you want to touch on coalition building as you're heading into this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I would take a couple of different approaches for this. I think in terms of advancing a specific item within your partnership, you really have to identify some strong champions, 2 or 3 people who can totally get behind it. I think a few people who are dedicated, going to put in the time, the effort, the work to further advance that is good for an individual policy. But when we are talking about your partnership or your coalition as a whole, you have to try and recruit a wide umbrella, a large group within your community. Something in Alachua County we had a lot of success with, honestly, was just networking with other community groups and seeing what their interests were and what they were pursuing. So for example, at the same time as the retail license was being advocated for by Tobacco Free Alachua, the local council of PTAs was pursuing something called the Children's Trust, which was basically just funding for children's programs. So both of these groups targeting things that impact the community's children, schools, working towards the health physically and mentally of kids, they can work together and talk about and support for each other. Hey, we are doing the same thing in a slightly different way. So Tobacco Free Alachua and our partnership in general saw a lot of success, honestly, just going to meetings for other groups, supporting them however we can, even if it was just by showing up. But then in turn, they were incredibly supportive of tobacco-related efforts. And I think that just goes towards any other lasting change or relationship you would want within your community. We don't want these things to be transactional, like, hey, I'll sign your petition, you sign mine, I'll go to your meeting, you come to mine. But letting these groups know that, hey, we are both working for positive change locally. Let's be supportive. Let's hear each other out. Maybe I can connect you to someone at the health department or someone at the hospital network that might be helpful. So just really being there for a more of a lasting back and forth as opposed to like a handshake and you move on.
Has the Children's Trust become sort of a permanent part of your partnership as a result of that, or did they work to you specifically on the tobacco license at the time? And
so the people who currently oversee the Children's Trust aren't, but the groups that were advocating for it have. So the council, PTAs, a lot of local school moms, and some people within the school board have become more regular partnership attendees, yes.
Kim, I feel like I hate to go back to you again, but I feel like you had an interesting approach to that coalition building that might be a really cool strategy for some of the other locations. I'm thinking when we started early in the process.
Yeah, well, and two things. One was all Commissioner Hetherington who championed this, but she brought together a coalition early on when in the very first stages of talking about this. We also have one of our partnership members, she's on the call, Jen Ahern, but she's with Children's Services Council. And she was also really instrumental in those early processes and meeting with commissioners, but bringing all of the stakeholders to the table. So between Children's Services Council, from the Sheriff's Department, the school district, county staff, everyone who's going to be involved in this and implementing this, they brought it all together. They had a meeting early on, talked about the reasons behind it, concerns that people had, got it all out on the table. And because of that, they had really strong support early on. One of the things too that really helped is at that first commission meeting when you had some pushback about how they would be able to implement all of this and how the stores would be affected. One of the deputies who just happened to be at the meeting, because he's at every meeting, just stood up and he was like, he knows what's going on because he's been involved in this from the very beginning. And he just mentioned that, they were really concerned about certain stores. They knew who the offenders were. They knew who they needed to pay extra attention to. And just having him aware of what was going on and the reasons behind it and on board, that shareholder buy-in is one of the reasons that it was so successful.
I think that's one of the reasons they were all in on enforcement also. They were brought to the table because I was at that very first meeting and everybody was sort of trying to figure out what they wanted, what would be the ideal thing, and everybody was there, making valuable suggestions. And they were in on the enforcement piece from the very beginning and stayed strong on that enforcement throughout the process. Yeah, I thought that meeting, the reason I wanted to talk about that is because I thought, you're right, the champion was key because she called that meeting. Like if you called the meeting or somebody else called the meeting, maybe not as, but this was the commissioner calling sort of a task force meeting is what I guess you would call it, with the school district and the health department and the sheriffs and the Children's Services Council, and we were involved. And I thought that was an incredibly smart way to do that. And by the way, for people who are listening, when the state law wasn't signed, that's one of the reasons it was easy to pick this back up and run with it, because so much of this kind of community legwork had happened leading up to this that it was easy to restart that process. It wasn't kind of a scattered kind of process. It was very well organized. But again, a single champion is probably one of the more effective things that you could ask for with a government agency like that. Did Kylie or Brittany, did you have anything you wanted to add to that sort of coalition building piece of it?
Sure, I do have just one quick note I would add. I think, on a more preliminary level, when people are trying to think about, how do I identify some of these groups that would be most affected by the policy that we are educating on and hoping to ultimately have adopted. I think, just going real basic and looking at some of the data and where, you know, some of the more pressing issues are manifesting and in which communities they're manifesting. Dr. Homo, you talked earlier about the way menthol products were designed to be used, and we know how flavor products are designed to be used, and just a lot of the predatory marketing that can really tailor the message that is being delivered in order to kind of make that pitch to build the coalition. And in doing so, you know, from the start, it could be very helpful to make sure that not only you have the PTAs and the Boys and Girls Clubs and, you know, some of the well-known community stakeholders, but so that you have individuals from those communities that would ultimately be affected by the policy, because they're ultimately being affected by the retail environment, you know, making sure that you're diversifying the representativeness of those voices. And when, you know, the issue is brought forth to the decision makers, that, you know, that messaging is brought from the individuals that have the power to organize and make the change on down to the individuals that will ultimately be affected by the change. So that's the only little thing that I would add.
It's interesting you said that, because the Stewart's experience, right? So they did the thing after Martin County, and they did the 21. They didn't really push the licensing issue. There was some issues with it, but in that conversation I had with one of the members of the city commission, one of the biggest offenders in the city of Stewart is by Stewart Middle School. It's in a minority neighborhood, and he said, you know, we go and do these compliance checks, and then they accuse of us of picking on them because they're in the minority neighborhood. Boy, that's a tough, how do you fillet that fish? Because you are picking on them because they are violating it, and then they're using, you know, they're trying to imply that you're picking on it because, and that's such a hard issue, because it really is affecting a disparate population negatively. And if you do the right thing, then maybe that comes across like you're being too heavy-handed with a specific subset of the population. So yeah, it was a really dynamic conversation I had with that particular commissioner as a result of that, because I could see it from both sides. I saw his side of the story, absolutely right. I can understand from a historical perspective where that store probably feels like they're being picked on. I see the whole big argument, but ultimately what I want to do is do what's right for the kids. And if there's a store in any community that's, you know, selling to underage minors at a higher percentage than other stores, then I think that's what we ultimately have to, like, at the end of the day, we have to say, I'm trying to do what's best for the kids. I can't, you know, I have to be a little bit careful about how I couch it, but I really have to do this because it's what's right for our youth. There was a question in the chat. I'm going to go off topic for a second because it kind of ties into this a little bit, but somebody asked if the state legislation was going to be reintroduced, and I apologize. This is so hot off the press. I meant to add it to my PowerPoint last night and I forgot to do it, but yes. So the bill that was vetoed in the fall was reintroduced by, there's a Senate version. The Senate number is 1080, and Matt Hudson is the senator who introduced it. And interesting, my understanding is Debbie Mayfield, who was actively involved in pushing this last year, is now the House Majority Leader, and she has been asked not to submit any legislation herself. But I have a pipeline of information that tells me that she has requested, she went to Matt Hudson and said, please introduce this. That tells you there's leadership support in the Senate side. The House side is the same language from last year, and I think it was Jackie Toledo, who is, I believe, on the west coast of Florida, somewhere, I want to say Pinellas County. I'm maybe off on, I may be Hillsborough, but somewhere in that Tampa Bay area. And she has introduced her bill from last year, which ultimately was what was signed into law. So there are two companion bills that are probably going to get fast-tracked because of leadership's support of them. Now, two things I would say about that. One is I'm very hopeful that it will pass again because it did last year. I have no doubt. I don't know how the governor would respond to that for the second consecutive year. So what does that mean for us in the local community? Well, I think the reason it ties into this particular question we were talking about is, why don't we start building the coalitions now and have the discussion so that if something goes well, we don't have to worry about it, but if something doesn't go well, we're not starting from scratch again, and here it is the fall, and now we're just starting to get it moving. Oh, and then they introduce it next year. We could play that game for a long, long time. So I think the time to soften up and build your support is now, because we'll know the answer by the end of April as to whether this passed or didn't pass. Then we won't know about the signing for who knows how long, but at least we'll have some sense of that. I probably wouldn't put the brakes on it this year, knowing that the governor vetoed it last year. And I would even kind of say that in your local community. I'm not sure if it passes, and the governor's going to sign it anyway. So I think we should just keep, we can plug along on what we think would do, how we would best serve our community. I think would be the way to go on that. The next question I have is kind of tied in, and it's what is the easiest way to start the process without overwhelming decision makers? Because it is, kind of an interesting and a big ask. And I had, I had Martin on here mostly because of the thing we already talked about, Kim, which was the sort of, that sort of task force approach. But I was wondering if anybody else had any other suggestions to just get your foot in the door, and because it's a big ask. Has anybody had any success with sort of getting the ball rolling early on? Or how do you identify a champion? How do you reach out and identify a champion? Any thoughts, Kylie, maybe?
Yeah, so I will go ahead and jump in. I know that when we came in August of 2019 to the commission and we're like, we're just letting you know this, and they kind of took it up and they're like, well, this is a state issue, we're not going to overstep. We were kind of back at square one, like, okay, where do we start? Where do we go? And we really identified our city government, and they had, 43 retailers. They were up there in retailer density. So we just went and had, the partnership had a conversation with them. And, we talked about the federal age being 21 and just the lack of enforcement. I think one of the biggest tools we had was just having that store mapper data for, like, of your 43 stores, 3 were visited last year. So, you don't have a picture of what's going on, and, overwhelming them with the license wasn't really where it was going to start. We weren't going to go in hot and heavy like, hey, here's a tobacco retail license. We think you should do this. It was more, this is kind of the concern that we're seeing in this area. How do you feel we can best address it? And so they chose not to go the license route, but to raise the age to 21 and do local enforcement. So the code enforcement officers are enforcing the 21 law. And what that allows the partnership to do is actually we have a great relationship with the person who is doing the enforcement. So we can follow it over the next year and say, hey, of the 43 stores this year, you visited 21. That's a great improvement from 3. But how else can we support this? What else can we do? And maybe from that point, they can say, oh, if we add some funding behind this, if we add a license behind this, then that's kind of where we go from there. But really starting with that enforcement, and that lack of enforcement that's currently happening seems to resonate with them a lot without overwhelming them.
Yeah, I think the 21 is a good way to get your foot in the door, because there is a discrepancy. It's 21 at the federal level. That is the law of land. State law is 18. We have an enforcement gap. And you can get a conversation about raising the age locally and enforcing it better, which is sort of what Vero Beach ended up ultimately doing. We had that similar experience when we had no age for vaping back in the 2012 era. And we were getting our foot in the door by saying, there's no age restriction on these products. You can pass that. Oh, and by the way, while you're doing it, you can roll them into, the Clean Indoor Air Act language, so people aren't using them in parks, playgrounds, beaches, or wherever. You can do it anywhere. And you can also put restrictions on point of sale, like we got product placement ordinances rolled into that. But we got in the door with the 18, and I think 21 is a great way to get your foot in the door, because it's a little bit of a complicated issue, but in a nutshell, like we talked about earlier, it's 21 at the federal level, but they're not showing up to enforce it. It's 18 at the state level, so they're not showing up to enforcement. How can we do better by our citizens in our local community? I think is the nuts and bolts in that. Did anybody else want to weigh in on that issue of starting the process without overwhelming folks?
I'll just add quickly that one of the advantages, so I think meeting with your local decision makers is really important all the time, not just when you have an issue. And fortunately, I knew Commissioner Hetherington through the leadership program prior to her running for office. And so we had conversations. I know her kids, I know where they go to school. So we had conversations about the issues that her own children were facing in their schools, being exposed to vaping and e-cigarettes and all that stuff. So when she was elected, we set up a meeting almost right away to talk about those issues. I think parents are in this particular issue and field one of the most important advocates for us, because they know firsthand what their kids are dealing with. I've kind of almost seen it with our commission as their children are getting older. You can tell they used to really focus on issues that were a problem in tobacco prevention 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when their kids were in school. And as those issues evolve and their kids are older and not necessarily as affected, they maybe don't understand the the changing demographics that we're dealing with and the changing issues that we're dealing with. So meeting with her firsthand and approaching it from what her kids were seeing, what stats we have from the Florida Youth Tobacco Survey, from the store surveys that we're doing that Kylie mentioned, and then talking about together why that's an issue and what the possible solutions are, got the ball rolling, and she really picked it up from there and made it happen.
You made a really interesting point without naming any names. Commissioners who we worked with 10 years ago that were incredibly supportive of issues changed their vote because now their kids are in college. I'm not saying they changed their vote because their kids are in college, but it was less of an issue for them because their kids were in college than it was for Commissioner Hetherington, who had kids who were right in the right age bracket for this to be a big time problem for her. Yeah, so that's a good point about trying to identify a champion. If you can find somebody who's got kids that are in the age bracket that are overly affected by, say, e-cigarettes, that might be a strategy you can employ too, is in trying to identify a champion. A good point, because I think the person who championed stuff in the past will not champion it anymore, as we learned in Martin County.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, did you have anything to add to that before I move on to the next question? Anything about starting up the process?
No, I think she covered most of it. I would just also say, as a general reminder, that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I think a lot of the success can be accomplished, like you mentioned, about not just communicating with your local leaders or community groups when you have an agenda item, but also just maintaining those relationships, continue to build rapport and inform them. And then when it comes to an actual policy issue, it almost turns into like Inception, kind of like you're just like planting the seed and, hey, this is like on the horizon. We just want to put this on your radar down the road. And as you start to do that to more and more people, you can sort of like test the water and see, oh, this person is incredibly receptive to this idea or this project. They have a personal connection to it, or maybe they know someone who does. So don't be afraid to just share things that are maybe 6 months or a couple of years down the road. It doesn't have to be in the immediate future, because then you can sort of get a sense of what the reception will be like in your community and who you can gravitate towards for support on that effort.
Yeah, and I think that allows you to get it the way you want it written. You know, like Martin County's ordinance was so incredibly strong because it was a long process. And does it have every single ideal thing in it? Probably not, but it's about as good of an ordinance as we hope to get ultimately at the time. Not, you can't go back and fix it later, but the key was it was a long process where everybody got to weigh in on it, and it became a very good ordinance over time. And if you get, if you pass language in a hurry and you don't have everything in it, it's, it might be harder. And then it's the model for the next county or the next city. And you want to be careful about that. You want to make sure you have everything you want in there, because other people are going to look at that as models. Like people are looking at your ordinance, Ryan, as a model. Same thing with Kim's. I mean, that's the stuff gets passed around a lot, is here's what Latchwood did, here's what Martin did. And they're good, solid ordinances, which is great. But if somebody passes, Vero Beach passes a 21 with code enforcement, people are looking at that language, they might go, oh, that's an easier way to do it. And if you really want a strong ordinance, you kind of want to, you want to make sure you get everything in it early on, because that's why in Broward, the approach is going to be, let's go to Sunrise and let's get a model ordinance done, because everybody else will look at that in the county. And if we go to 4 places and somebody does it quicker, but does a weaker ordinance, then that becomes the piece of paper that everybody passes around in the county. So I think it's okay to go slow. I agree with you, Ryan. It's okay to go slow and get it the way you want it, so that it's a model for other people to use regionally or locally. Think bigger picture about who might be looking at it down the road. I had a question come up that I'm going to address real quick. And that was, does the proposed T21 preempt stronger local laws? And the way the law is currently written, it's very similar to last year, and it does not. That was the language, the 1080, Senate Bill 1080 and the House bill that we talked about a few moments ago. Those are not preemptive of local ordinances at the moment, but you know how these things work. They go committee by committee, they get amended over time. They don't end the way they start. And so you do have to watch that. But as of now, it would not prohibit any of the things that we've been talking about today on licensing or on passing stronger or stricter rules locally. That language is not in there at the moment. This is a really good question that came from Columbia County, actually. When working toward a tobacco retail license in a city or a county, what components do you feel are most important to obtain? And some examples they put in here were the ban on flavored products versus reducing the number of retailers, fee. I'm going to start off on that, and then I'll kind of pass the hat around. I think for me, the big ones are age, get the age in there, strong penalties for violations, and frequent, even if you define a number specifically, compliance checks. Those are the big three things for me. And the rest of it is, if you're going to underscore the ban on flavored cartridges or try to parallel FDA language on tobacco, which should be included anyway. I mean, it should be e-cigarettes. I mean, it should be redefining tobacco consistent with the federal level. But then after that, I think the thing is 21, make the penalty stiff for the retailer and hold their feet to the fire by going in there frequently to see them. Some of those other things, like we talked about in the presentation, are more plug-ins, like if you want to exceed the flavor ban or do retailer density and that sort of thing. So, but I'll pass the hat around and see if anybody else has any thoughts. Having a few of these in play, what the components were that I know, for example, Ryan, yours includes the retail density, for example, and there's probably a story as to why that was one of the things they focused on.
Yeah, Brittany, did you want to say something? I noticed you unmuted if you wanted to go first.
Oh, you can go first, Ryan. I'll follow.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, just to follow up on that, Dr. Hummel, something else that I think really got legs for Alachua County's license and a lot of people were able to get behind was the retailer restrictions, particularly when it comes to around schools. So one of the core components for Alachua is no new tobacco retailers within 1,000 feet of a public school. That's a very palpable message you can tell to the decision makers, like, hey, we have these kids walking out of school. They're looking for things to do. They're going to get snacks at a gas station. We don't want them to be more exposed to these products. Everyone has seen and read about the point of sale statistics that show how often kids are around these products. They're more likely to use them, try them, especially the advertising. In Alachua, any retailers that were within 1,000 feet of a school were grandfathered in. But that means if I own a vape shop right across from Gainesville High School and I decide to sell it, that next owner cannot maintain it as a tobacco retailer, which is pretty cool. But it's a very easy thing. Hey, we don't want these popping up around schools, but you could probably segue that into, well, what about public parks? What about these other spaces where young people are, depending on your community? And I'm sure you could do the same thing for beaches, other natural places, that it's easy to convey a message that's not too data heavy, but it really just makes simple sense.
Yes, Ryan, and this is exactly why I wanted you to go first before me, because I kind of had a feeling that would have been the angle you might have gone. So looking at it from, the bureau level, the statewide level, having a picture of everything, and also looking at some of the lessons learned from Alachua and from Martin County. What I would always recommend is, again, going back to the data. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but going back to the data to see really how bad the problem is locally first, because your decision makers are going to want to know why. And sometimes, other than, the FDA did it, sometimes that's just not good enough for them. And they want to be able to know, why do we need to spend the time, the money, the resources, the energy, the effort to do this locally? So I would look at those factors. And then I would also do not root cause mapping, but I would do some power structure analysis and really do your homework on the decision makers and the communities that they serve. Because at the end of the day, they are hopefully wanting to be responsible to their constituents. These are the individuals that either voted them in or gave them a vote of confidence to become appointed or what have you. So you want to be able to basically highlight those issues relative to the communities that they serve in order to kind of make the argument as to why it would be necessary. It could end up that it's flavors. It could end up that it's zoning and density. It could end up that it's product placement. It could end up that it's age. You just don't know until you get in there and really start to decipher through that data and connect the dots based on what those decision makers' priorities are. Do they have children? How old are how old are their children? Things like that.
I would just add, I echo everything you guys say, but for us, we reached a few challenges with some of those pieces that were really important to keep in there. I definitely think the great takeaway from Martin County, at least that they held on to, was that without having the retail license, there was no meat to this policy, because you can fine a retailer for violating the policy, but if you don't have the ability to take away their right to sell their products, there's really no consequence for them that matters, because they can pay their fines. I mean, they may make the sales up in an afternoon when kids get out of school. So they, when we went to the city of Stuart, that was the piece that they really couldn't click on. And I'm still, you know, fighting on that, because they did pass a policy. They didn't keep it in there. They did give strict fines, and they really felt assured that those fines would keep stores in compliance. I don't necessarily agree with that. So I'm still not letting that, you know, rest. But I think the other piece of it is actually following through and implementing the policy. So that was another thing at the county level. The sheriff's department was really on board with doing these checks. And their goal was to check every store twice a year. One of the pieces of data that Brittany provided me with was we have over 200 stores, and around 20 to 30 of them were being checked each year. So you may get checked once every 5 years. Not really a big deal from the ABT and FDA level. Having the sheriff's department on board with actually performing the checks was really pivotal. Unfortunately, the strongest language that they would put in the policy was regular frequent checks of the stores without an actual number that they were committing to. I don't feel bad about it terribly, because I know that there is long-standing support for actually going out and making sure those checks happen. I would like for it to be in writing, particularly as there's leadership changes and things like that. And if a new sheriff comes to office and isn't really as gung-ho about it, it may not happen. But I think the important thing is also just making sure that there's an implementation plan. So our county, I'm jumping to a question that I see in the chat box, but talking about if we have any data from this, our county just rolled it out this month. But one of the things that they did, I worked with them on getting a recent updated list of all of the retailers so that they could send letters to them to inform them of what was happening, so that they can immediately roll out. At the city level, they actually, before the ordinance even passed, started compliance checks. They're doing it through code enforcement, so it's a little bit different. And I think they were like having a lot of backdoor conversations about who they needed to check, and they just started doing it before the ordinance even passed its second reading. So making sure that it actually doesn't just pass as an ordinance, but is then implemented and introduced into regular process.
Yeah, and that addresses, I have a bunch of questions about enforcement, so you're dead on. And the key here is, if age restrictions alone worked, then there'd be no underage use. We've had 18 on the books forever. Use among 18-year-olds or under 18 should be 0, right? We know it doesn't work unless it's enforced. None of the policies we've put in place will work without some sort of checks and balances to hold people accountable. So you touched on one of the questions in the chat box. It's kind of parallel to one I have in advance of the talk, and that is, what are the potential routes for enforcement? Because I think Martin County does it differently than Alachua County. So I'm going to let Ryan address how they enforce it in there. And then Ryan, while you're touching on that, I think I saw in the fall there was an article that you had some early enforcement data that was released back in, I think it was October or so, that showed that you had turned up some stores that were breaking the law. So I'm going to turn it over to you about how you enforce it in Alachua.
Yeah, so to start on the first part about the enforcement mechanism, I think everyone in every county should work with their county commission, city, local leaders to see what they are most comfortable with, because just because Alachua does it one way doesn't mean it works for Martin County or Indian River, Broward, or wherever it is. So I remember we went to our sheriff department a few years ago, and they were like, no go, like there's no way we'll be able to do this, which is fine. So you just have to find another route. So in Alachua, we do compliance checks through a private vendor called ISN. It's Information Services Network Corporation. And basically they are an existing company that already does FDA compliance checks, not just for tobacco, but for other items as well. So they already have logistics in place, systems in place. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. We presented this as an option to our county, and they were like, great, let's do it. Let's write a contract. and then the cost of the license pays for that vendor. And then what they do, it's written in with our local TRL at least once annually. Every single vendor will be visited with that minor who's about 19, 20 years old, try to buy the product. If they are busted, they'll try to get checked again. Obviously, last year was the first full year of us doing checks, and then the pandemic hitting, we had a little bit of a delay. We started January, February doing checks, and there was a huge gap. They didn't really continue until the fall. So we did not visit every single retailer last year like we wanted to, but they have continued and are progressing. And then as you alluded to, so I actually did get a little bit more recent data. And last year we saw about 110, 120 retailers total, which is about a third of those that exist in Alachua County. And of those, about 33% failed their compliance check. So we know even though there was a very long lead up to implementing this, all these retailers knew they had a ton of time, they were going to be checked. So we're talking 33% are failing. So not too great in the bid scheme. And that ranges from mom and pop places to Walmarts and Winn-Dixie's. So it's not just the little guys failing, it's the major retailers as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if a third got dinged the first time and now they know it's real. If that gets better, like again, the frequency of it's important, because if they get dinged once and then you never show back up again, you didn't really change behavior, did you? So that the frequency of it's really important, because if they know you're coming and you're coming and you're coming and you're coming and there's no end to it until they behave, you will change behavior. But if you show up once, and as Kim said, you know, you might get checked 5 years down the road, that fine or whatever penalty that they've paid has more than been paid off by, you know, just continuing to break the law in that gigantic gap. So yeah, I thought the reason I was interested is because there's been this big discussion about, you know, a third party vendor like the group you talked about versus law enforcement. And one of the issues with it is when, and I assume your reports you get back, Ryan, have like the denominator, meaning we tested, you gave the number. We went to 120 stores and a third failed, as opposed to a law enforcement only give you the tickets that they wrote. So in other words, if you went to 100 stores and they wrote 33 tickets, I'm going to get 33 tickets, but I don't know the denominator. I don't know if they went to 33 stores and it's 100% fail. I don't know if they went to 330 stores and that was a 10% fail. And I think the third party vendors reporting might be different and more important for us in public health, because I think knowing the percentage is really, really, really important. And I'm hopeful that in the law enforcement, like that we have a way to get the other information from a group like the sheriffs. That, well, we did go to 120 places and we caught, you know, 15 of them, whatever. I think that other piece of information is as important as who failed, is who succeeded. And that be really important. Kylie, who does the enforcement up in Indian River or Vero Beach? Is that code enforcement or is that some other group?
It's code enforcement, but it's also a mix. The local police department does take on a good amount. So I believe a month or two after they had passed the ordinance, they went through it, the law enforcement went through and did 9 compliance checks. So they were already triple what they normally did. And so we had, I believe, 2 fail from that round, but they kind of help out code enforcement.
And does code enforcement use underage minors, you know, to go in and make attempted buys, or what when they do code enforcement, what are they enforcing, or how do they enforce it?
Yeah, it's usually they send in someone between, 18 and 20 who will go in and try and make a purchase. Okay.
Yeah, so they're not just walking by and seeing what's going on. They're actually doing the underage attempted purchase, because that's really important on the compliance of that. There was a question in the chat that Val referred me to, and
I did just get a couple directly. One was, how are retailers informed of any failures in compliance, and what procedure is the follow-up? And also, is there a standard form for compliance checks that everyone's using?
Ryan, I'll let you take that one first, since you have the long history of compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just as a little bit of an addendum to that, I think it's important to note that luckily for us, like our health department, our partnership, we aren't involved very deeply into compliance. So it's like hands off from a grantee perspective, and our code enforcement and our county attorney handles the legal aspects. So how it works in Alachua County, it's a non-confrontational compliance visit. So the underage buyer and the ISN clerks, they go in, they try to make a purchase. If they do, They keep the product as evidence. They keep the receipt. They always take receipts when they are offered them. And then they give that information to county code enforcement, who then creates a letter that is sent to that retailer or whoever the owner is according to the license. Not always is that owner in Alachua County. We know like some of these Circle K's, Dollar Generals, they might live outside of the county but own a bunch of stores. So they are sent a letter saying, hey, we conducted our check on this day and time. You were found to have violated. You have to appear in front of a special magistrate on this day and time to hear your case. Obviously, every single buy, they have the evidence, they have the product and proof that the person was underage. So there's not really much to argue about it, but it still goes through a formal hearing process before they are penalized, which in the case of Alachua County is no sale of tobacco products for 7 days for your first violation. So it is a very non-confrontational. It's not like the sheriff or Gainesville Police goes in and serves them a subpoena or anything like that. It's just, hey, this was done randomly, unannounced, you failed, here's the procedure following through.
So
ours is set up pretty similarly. I mean, it's just going into effect now, so I don't really have any data, but they both have to, in both the county and the city, if they're found in violation, they're going to have to appear in front of a magistrate. And they did roll the fee at the city level for the magistrate. That was one of the things they kind of adjusted their violation fee scale so that they were considering they're going to have to pay their magistrate fees, plus this is our fee. So this is what they're actually paying for violation.
wow. Brittany, there's a question in the chat that's kind of interesting. Is there any data from other states that have adopted tobacco retail licenses? And I guess I'll parenthetically say, you know, with decreased youth access, I guess would be the key thing we're going for here. Is there any, because so many states have started well before Florida.
Right. I'm sure there is some data out there because prior to us, 80% of cities and states combined did have some form of tobacco retail licensing. So what I can do is I can put out some feelers for what that data may look like, whether it's like point in time data or what have you, and provide that so we can have that information. But I'm sure there's data out there. I just don't have it readily available.
Yeah, it's been over, you know, most of these, the T21 at least has been mostly over the last 4 years. I think it really started about 4 years ago is when we really started to see it. And I'm sure in looking at the maps that I put up, there are some communities that went first that I'm sure have some data. And I'm sure a lot of other places jumped on board because there was data to demonstrate that it was working effectively. But again, if you don't enforce it, it doesn't matter what, you can make the age 100. If you don't go in and do a compliance check, you're not going to get any reduction in the use of anyone below that age. I had one other question on here that we kind of touched on a little bit before, and that was going back to the menthol thing. And I'll just throw it out there. And Brittany, you maybe, you've already spoke to this, but just in the context of this question, do you feel that prohibiting or restricting the sale of menthol and other flavored tobacco products will reduce health disparities and social inequities? And so I'll let you go first on that. I certainly have an opinion on that, but I know you probably have more data than I do.
I think it certainly can. And then there's also the issue of unintended consequences and things of that nature. So I think it's all in the way in which it's done. You know, there was a point in time where, you know, pharmacy policy was a consideration. And then the argument became that, you know, you could be exacerbating social inequities based on the fact that, you know, some people may only be able to get fresh food or healthy foods from pharmacies like a Walgreens or a CVS or what have you. So I think given the fact that those products are targeted and specifically tailored to disparate communities, whether it's low socioeconomic status, low median household income, low educational attainment, it is something that I'd like to see done at some point. I think it could be, it's all in the way that it's framed. I guess that's how I would sum it up. It's all in the way that it's framed. Because the argument can always be that, oh, well, you know, once they're adults, they can do as they choose, but people negate the fact that 90% of smokers, adult smokers, have begun prior to the age of 18. So I think it definitely requires a delicate approach in how the message is framed. It will definitely require a very comprehensive effort that that cessation would have a big role in, because, we never want to be the villains here, right? We're already the cleanup crew, having to adopt policies or influence the adoption of policies that have resulted from terrible policies and processes for centuries now. But we don't want to give off the perception that, the unintended consequences are greater than the reward. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I think if you look at the menthol ban, first of all, I think we should let the FDA handle the menthol ban. I think that's a complicated issue with a lot of social consequences to it that I'm not sure we need to be weighing into on the local level. But I will say that there's two groups of people affected by the menthol ban. There's the people who currently use menthol cigarettes, and if you just took it away, would have to confront the choice of something that's not menthol or quitting, right? I don't think, that group will have to make that decision if it disappears. People who used chocolate flavored cigarettes made that decision in September of 2009. It's the same thing. But the other group is the group who haven't started yet, right? We're talking about our underage kids who we know it's an easier point of entry. Just look at menthol. We know it's an easier point of entry to have a flavored product than an unflavored product. And so I'll go to the other flavors as a result of which is a broader topic, right? It doesn't come with the sort of baggage necessarily the menthol discussion has. There's all these flavored products, especially e-cigarette flavors. We know that some of the chemicals in there are causing problems. There was an article just last week about how the chocolate, things that have the chocolate flavor in it seem to be causing more lung damage than some of the other products. We've known that with the things that use the diacetyl, which is in the butter flavor. We know that they're more harmful, that some of the most harmful chemicals in there that you inhale are the flavors. And so again, you have two groups. You have the group that use the flavors currently, and you have the group that is being targeted by flavors. And I think we have to just make a decision. We should get rid of the flavors. I think it's the best approach to preventing youth use. And there will be a group of people who decided to use these, who have an addiction, will have to confront a choice. Do I use just tobacco flavor, even though it tastes like crap, or do I quit? Isn't that our goal? Reduce the appeal of it so that people who are currently using, that we did this with secondhand smoke. We improved the number of people who quit smoking because they didn't want to be inconvenienced stepping outside in the cold, or they didn't want to feel like they were some sort of pariah at the office anymore. And it made them look at what they were doing and make a decision to make a healthier choice. I know that might be tough love in some regards to say that we should just get rid of these flavors, and there will be a population that will be inadvertently affected negatively, but ultimately the goal is to make them make a better choice, be healthier in the long run, and just have to make that choice. Okay, you can't have chocolate, you can't have butterscotch anymore. You have to go with just what it tastes like, which is dirt. Sorry about that, but that's what it is, and that's what you're using now. And I think we ought to make that decision more broadly. And I think the FDA should take the lead on that. Of that, I have no doubt. So I'm not trying to push people in the local community from adding another thing that makes a complex argument when you're trying to get good policy now. But I think if you get language in there that says whatever the FDA decides, we should do too. If the FDA bans menthol, you can't sell menthol at your local convenience store anymore. And you can enforce that locally if it's written into your ordinance that way. And it helps get it out of there quicker that you do it locally. So that would be my take on flavors and menthol in general is, yeah, let the FDA handle it, but let's underscore those rules locally so that we can jump on it when it changes. We can jump on it quickly when it changes at the federal level and not have to go through this layer of trying to get the state to then weigh in with their slow process before we can do something more locally. So it's 12:10, which means we've exhausted the hour, and we still have more to talk about, but that's great. That was an incredibly dynamic conversation. I want to thank everybody for just doing an amazing job with some very complex issues. And I think we've demonstrated that there are multiple ways to do this, and that, working on the local community and being careful to what local needs are is probably the most important part. But there are some key things you can get in there that's consistent will go a long way to helping our kids.